let's get straight in.
Okay.
Sam, I watched MLK FBI, and the first thing that came to my mind was, there must have been reams of documents that, you know, not just you but your team had to go through in order to grasp or get a real understanding of what you had access to. It's your job, yes, but did you love the process? Can you really love the process?
Can I really what?
Did you love the process? And can you really love a process like that?
Oh, listen, you know, I'll say this to you. I do love the process. I mean, I've been doing it quite a long time, and the idea of always digging into material, be it, you know, the text from the FBI or the archival footage or the audio, it's a process. It's not to say it's not hard, that it's not time consuming, but it's something that you have to do if you want to make documentary films like these, you know. So, you know, and hopefully what you can do is you can gather around you a group of people who can help you dig into this material, dig into the footage, you know, and make it not as overwhelming as it sometimes feels, because it can feel overwhelming, quite honestly, but it's part of the process. And I always say to people, you know, Joel, that in some ways love the process more than the finished product at times, you know.
I did wonder, and that's kind of why I had to ask, because I'd imagine you have to love the process more than the finished article, because once you're finished, you're probably looking for another process to get entwined in.
Exactly.
So that makes sense. How long was the process though?
For documentary film, this was pretty short. This was this was only about 2 years. I mean, some of these other independent documentaries that I have been involved with has been 5 years, 6 years. I'm finishing one now that I've been involved with off and on for over 20 years. So this was short. 2 years is pretty short.
I love the way it starts. So,
thanks, man.
Because before I even get into that, tell some of our viewers and listeners a little bit about what they can expect from MLK FBI, out on January the 15th in this country. What's it all about, Sam? That's what they're going to be sitting there wondering.
Yeah, the film basically looks at Dr. Martin Luther King, who was at 1963, probably did one of the greatest speeches ever, the March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech. And out of that speech, Edgar Hoover, basically through the voice of one of his lieutenants, William Sullivan, says, this is probably one of the most dangerous black men who's ever come on the face of the earth. And his responsibility, his job from that point on was to surveil Dr. King, wiretap, monitor Dr. King's, whereabouts and what he was doing for the next 5 years, because he felt that he needed to, destroy Dr. King's reputation, because if Dr. King was going to succeed, he was going to upend what J. Edgar Hoover's notion of American democracy was. So the film tells a parallel story of Dr. King's civil rights movement from Montgomery all the way to Selma, from the Montgomery bus boycott up to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and his assassination at the same time as the FBI was constantly monitoring him. And they went so far as to even create a letter that was supposed to be from a black person, basically saying to Dr. King, he was such a horrific man because he had these relationships with other women, that he should kill himself because he was a disgrace to his community. He was a disgrace to the church. That's how far they went. And, it looks at King and J. Edgar Hoover on a different level than how most people have seen and imagined them.
I mentioned the way it starts because it literally forced me to think about who would be considered the moral leader of your nation now in 2020, in this moment.
Well, it's a different world we live in now. And I was saying that, remember, he didn't initiate the Montgomery bus boycott in the 1950s. It was the women who basically, the black women who said, we're not going to ride in the back of the bus anymore. And then they reached out and King became their spokesperson. And he was, as you know, Joel, he's such an eloquent orator that he became just the front and center presence of the community, of the movement. But there were, you can't forget that there were so many foot soldiers and other people like Fred Shuttlesworth and Andy Young and James Bevel and Ralph Abernathy and Dorothy Height. There's so many people who really were part of that movement who were just as front and center as Dr. King. Now we live in a time now in the 21st century where you don't have that one singular leader anymore. The movement is the leader. You know, the movement steps forward. The Black Lives Matter movement has replaced the one individual now, Dr. King. So it's a different world we live in now, you know. And I don't think you need a Dr. King like we did before. I mean, you know, we've had other voices since Dr. King. We've had Jesse Jackson, we had Al Sharpton, but there's never been anyone who's going to have that same kind of presence. We had Malcolm X. We never had anyone who had the same presence as Dr. King today.
As you touched on in the last question, he was made to look like or referred to as the most dangerous man in America, even though his mantra, his recurring theme was love,
nonviolent protest,
non-violence. I mean, when you look at the way that his narrative was juxtaposed alongside, I guess, Malcolm X at the time, or its two stories, and I guess the polarity in their difference of how to bring about this freedom. When you look at the vociferous way that the FBI went after Martin Luther King, even though his mantra was love, he was doomed before he even really got going, wasn't he?
Absolutely, because it wasn't the fact that he was more, you know, he was radical in his way, and the radicalism that he had made the FBI and the American government fearful of him. Because what was he going to do? He was basically saying, we don't want to be on the periphery anymore. We don't want to be, you know, like in the movies, Hattie McDaniels or Butterfly McQueen or Stephen Fetchit. We want to be front and center. We want equality. We don't want to be segregated anymore. And Hoover basically doing his surveillance was basically being the mouthpiece for lots of Americans, white Americans, who are saying, how dare Black people want to be front and center now? You remember that piece in the film, and the lady on the broadcast is interviewing Dr. King, and she asked the question, don't you feel that these protests are causing the violence in the community?
Yeah. I mean, that line of questioning was amazing, you know? I mean, you're sitting there and you're thinking, she had the audacity to say, you know, don't you think Black people are moving too fast?
Exactly.
Too fast for who?
Exactly.
And in comparison to what?
That's right.
Just amazing. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover did his damnedest. He was in charge for nearly 50 years, which is just amazing. But he did his damnedest to conflate, you know, his overt racism with with his obvious disdain for communism. And I guess with King, you know, in close proximity to Leveson, it gave that legs. Yeah,
because think of it too, you know, Joe, that King really never disassociated himself from Leveson, even though he told the Kennedys, "Yes, I have." He hadn't, you know, and you know, there always had been the rumor that Leveson was still a communist, even when he was associated with Dr. King. But you know, Dr. King wasn't tempted by the communist philosophy. You know, Leveson became a trusted advisor for King because King respected his mind, you know, respected his sort of logic about how to strategize, how to do things. And he wanted to surround himself with people that would help him strategize and, you know, to push the movement forward, And one of the things I say, Joel, is that if these tapes come out in 2027, one of the things when they come out, you know, one of the things that will be revealed in those tapes that people haven't thought about are the conversations that took place in those hotel rooms with King and his lieutenants, with Andy Young, with Ralph Abernathy, with Fred Shuttlesworth, with all his lieutenants who are involved in the SCLC about their strategies in places like Birmingham, in places like Albany, you know, in Selma. There'll be talks about that too, besides the stuff of these women coming into his room. Whatever. You know,
it was interesting to see the line of or the series of interviews at the end, and the amount of people that didn't think that the release of these tapes would serve anybody in any real value. I find that astounding, to be honest with you. But you know, roll on 2027. I'm not suggesting, Sam, that you'll become an FBI expert
No, I'm not
doing this. but I want your opinion on whether you feel this is their darkest hour in history.
Who knows, Joe? Who knows with the FBI? You know, what's interesting, what's ironic, though, is that the fact that in the last 4 years in America, Trump has been so down on the FBI, he's made us who were critical of the FBI be saying maybe they aren't too bad. You know, but who knows? You know, I know Comey says it was their darkest hour, but you know how history is. There's something that'll come up that'll show that they did some even more despicable things.
King was about freedom, yeah, for Black people.
Exactly.
And he was also about constructive coalition, something that really, I mean, it was referenced in the show, and something that really got me thinking, you know, because you can't do it on your own. You need constructive coalitions in order to bring about
to make change.
The freedom, I guess, that he was pursuing. Do we see any remnants of his legacy in that regard, in your opinion?
I think, you know, for me, quite honestly, when after the death of George Floyd in America, and watching the reaction from not only in America but around the world to his death and Black Lives Matter, that is what King was talking about. I was really, it's like, emotionally really happy and excited to see that the people all over the world connected. That was amazing, man. That was absolutely amazing, and that's what King was talking about. You know.
Last question then: has the pursuit of real equality has that taken hold, Sam? Are we in a place where we can say is that as deep rooted as the racism?
Man, racism is alive and well in America, and even though, you know, like I know, there's been change, some positive change. The notion of systemic racism still exists. As long as white people still feel like they got to hold on to the reins of power, racism will still exist. And you know, I mean, listen, we had a monumental election in this country, right? To take away this one guy, but we still got an old white man as the president of the United States, man. I mean, the big thing is finally to have a person of color as a vice president. That's change. I mean, you know. But but America, you know, like a lot of countries basically that are democratic, you know, they have to deal with their own baggage, and lots of Americans don't want to deal with this baggage, man.
Thanks for your time.